Elizabeth Taylor married 7 times. The world counted every marriage, every divorce, every wedding dress, every ring, every public humiliation, and every spectacular reconciliation. The world counted, and then the world drew its conclusion that she was reckless, that she was selfish, that she was a woman who treated marriage like a hobby and men like accessories and commitment like something that applied to other people. 7 marriages, 7 conclusions, all of them wrong. Because here is the question that nobody, not one journalist, not one biographer, not one television special in the 79 years of her extraordinary life ever asked clearly. Why? Not how many times, not with whom, not the details of the diamonds or the drama or the specific scandal of the moment. Why? Why did a woman of extraordinary intelligence, and Elizabeth Taylor was extraordinarily intelligent, whatever the world decided about her, why did a woman who had seen, more clearly than almost anyone alive, exactly what marriage cost keep trying? The answer to that question is not a scandal. It is not a cautionary tale. It is not the punchline that 5 decades of celebrity journalism made of her personal life. The answer is the story of a child who was handed to an institution before she understood what institutions did to people, and who spent the rest of her life trying to find, in the specific intimacy of marriage, the thing that institution had taken from her before she was old enough to name it. I am Mary. And today, we are going to talk about the real Elizabeth Taylor. Not the diamonds, not the marriages, not the mythology, the child they owned, the woman she became, and the specific, documented, institutional cruelty of a Hollywood system that took a 9-year-old girl and built a product from her, and then spent 40 years being surprised that the product had feelings. Stay with me, because by the end of this video you will never count her marriages again without understanding exactly what each one of them was really about. MGM signed Elizabeth Taylor when she was 9 years old. In part 2, I am going to tell you exactly what that contract meant and what it cost a child who was too young to understand she was signing away the right to be one. Elizabeth Taylor said publicly, on camera, that the only time she ever felt truly safe was when she was in love. In part 7, I am going to tell you why that statement is not romantic. It is the most heartbreaking thing she ever said. And it explains every single marriage. To understand why Elizabeth Taylor married 7 times, you need to understand who she was before the first marriage, before the first film, before MGM decided that her face was worth owning. She was born on the 27th of February, 1932, in Hampstead, London. Her father, Francis Taylor, was an art dealer. Her mother, Sarah Southern, was a stage actress who had given up her career to marry. This detail matters. Sarah Southern had been a performer. She understood the machinery of performance. She understood in a way that would shape everything that happened to her daughter, that beauty and talent were currencies, and that currencies were most valuable when properly managed. Elizabeth was a beautiful child. Not in the generic way of children who grow up to be ordinary-looking adults, but in the specific, striking, already formed way that made adults stop and stare and say things to her mother that her mother carefully remembered. Violet eyes, dark hair, a symmetry of feature that photographers would later describe as almost mathematically perfect. She was beautiful the way some children are, completely, immediately, and in a way that announced itself to every room she entered before she had learned to speak properly. The family moved to Los Angeles in 1939. Her father had business there. Her mother had other reasons that became clearer when, within 2 years of arriving, Sarah Taylor had arranged for her daughter to meet with the head of casting at Universal Pictures. Elizabeth was 9 years old. Universal passed. MGM did not. Louis B. Mayer, the head of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the most powerful studio in Hollywood, the man who had built the careers of Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney and Lana Turner and dozens of others whose adult lives became cautionary tales about what the studio system did to people it owned. Louis B. Mayer signed Elizabeth Taylor to a contract in 1941. She was 9 years old. Now here is what that contract actually meant, because the mythology around child stars almost always softens this into something that sounds like opportunity, rather than what it actually was. The contract gave MGM complete control over Elizabeth Taylor's professional life, what films she made, what roles she played, what she wore, how she spoke in public, what she weighed, and this is not a minor detail, this is a documented, specific, institutional obsession that MGM applied to every actress on its roster and applied to Elizabeth Taylor from the age of 9 onwards. She was weighed regularly. She was told, at 9 years old, what her body was permitted to be. The contract also gave MGM significant influence over her personal life, who she was seen with, what she was photographed doing, what narrative the studio wanted the public to receive about the girl with the violet eyes, who was going to make them a great deal of money. In exchange for all of this, in exchange for her childhood, her body, her image, her narrative, and the years between 9 and 18 that most human beings spend developing some foundational understanding of who they are independently of what other people require them to be, Elizabeth Taylor received a salary that MGM set and controlled, roles that MGM chose, and the specific, suffocating attention of an institution that needed her to be exactly what it had decided she was. She was 9 years old. She did not negotiate. She did not have a lawyer who was not connected to the studio's interests. She did not have a parent who was not, in some fundamental way, invested in the product that the studio was building from her daughter. Sarah Taylor sat in on every filming. She was present. She was, by every account, from people who were there, a woman who loved her daughter and who also understood, with the specific clarity of a former actress who had given up her own career, that her daughter's career was the family's primary asset. Elizabeth Taylor grew up on a film set, not in a house, not in a school with children her own age. On a set, under lights, performing for cameras operated by adults who needed specific things from her face at specific moments and who were entirely uninterested in what she might need from them. She made National Velvet in 1944. She was 12 years old. It made MGM millions. It made Elizabeth Taylor a star. And it completed a process that had been underway since she was 9, the process of replacing Elizabeth the child with Taylor the product, so seamlessly and so completely that for a very long time, neither she nor anyone around her could clearly see where one ended and the other began. She was 18 years old when she married for the first time. His name was Conrad Hilton Jr. He was 23. He was the heir to the Hilton Hotel fortune. He was also, and this was not something that was publicly known at the time, a violent alcoholic whose behavior on their honeymoon was so extreme that Elizabeth Taylor later described it as the most frightening experience of contact. Her life. She was 18 years old. She had grown up in an institution that had taught her, for 9 years, that her value was in her performance, that what she produced mattered, that what she experienced internally was secondary to what she presented externally. She did not leave Conrad Hilton immediately. She stayed for 8 months. She stayed because MGM needed her to, because a divorce in 1950 was a scandal, and scandals were bad for the product. She stayed because she was 18 years old and had spent 9 years being told by adults with institutional power what she was required to do. When she finally left, when the marriage ended and the divorce was filed, and the studio managed the narrative as carefully as it managed everything else, Elizabeth Taylor was 19 years old. She had already learned something that would shape every relationship she would ever have. That the people and institutions you trust the most are capable of requiring things from you that have nothing to do with your well-being. That love, or what is presented as love, can be a transaction. And that the only thing she had, that was entirely hers, the only currency that no contract could fully own, was the specific, enormous, overwhelming capacity to feel things deeply. She spent the rest of her life spending that currency, sometimes wisely, sometimes at catastrophic cost, but always, always with a completeness that no institution had ever been able to manufacture. Conrad Hilton Jr. was violent on their honeymoon. Elizabeth Taylor was 18 years old. MGM knew. In Part 3, I'm going to tell you what MGM did with that information and what it tells you about every institution that has ever claimed to care for the people it profits from. MGM knew about Conrad Hilton Jr. Not everything, not the specific details that Elizabeth Taylor would later describe privately, but enough. The studio had researchers. It had connections. It had the specific, comprehensive surveillance capacity of an institution that understood that the personal lives of its assets were institutional business. And what MGM knew about Conrad Hilton Jr. before the wedding, before the honeymoon, before the 18-year-old girl they had been building into a product for 9 years was placed alone in a hotel room with a violent man, was enough that the question of why they proceeded requires an answer. The answer is straightforward and devastating. Elizabeth Taylor married Conrad Hilton Jr. because it was good for the studio. A Taylor-Hilton wedding was publicity. It was the convergence of two American dynasties, Hollywood royalty and hotel fortune, and it generated the kind of coverage that no advertising budget could have purchased. MGM approved the match. MGM managed the engagement. MGM used the wedding. And when the marriage produced violence rather than publicity, when the product came back from her honeymoon with something broken in her eyes that the makeup artists had to carefully work around, MGM's primary concern was the narrative, not the 19-year-old, the narrative. She was told to stay. She stayed for 8 months. She left when staying became impossible, and MGM managed the divorce announcement with the same institutional precision it applied to every crisis. Brief statement. Sympathetic framing. Back to work immediately. Back to work. She was 19 years old. She had just left a violent marriage, and the institution that had owned her since she was 9 sent her back to the set. Marriage number 2, Michael Wilding. He was a British actor. He was 20 years older than her. He was gentle, cultivated, fundamentally decent, and, by his own later admission, entirely unprepared for the specific force of personality that Elizabeth Taylor brought to everything she touched. She was 20 when they married. He was 40. She wanted stability. She wanted someone who would not hurt her. She wanted the specific safety of a man who was older and established and unlikely to be violent. What she got was a kind man who was genuinely out of his depth. They had 2 sons, Michael Jr. in 1953 and Christopher in 1955. She loved her children with a ferocity that everyone who witnessed it described as the most unperformed thing about her. On a film set under lights, in costume, delivering dialogue, Elizabeth Taylor was a product. With her children, she was simply a mother. The distinction was total, and it was real. But the marriage to Wilding was not enough. Not because she was careless, but because she had learned, in the specific crucible of MGM and Conrad Hilton, and 19 years of being required to perform, rather than feel that safety was not the same as love, that a man who would not hurt her was not necessarily a man who could reach the specific, enormous interior life she was carrying. She needed someone who could match her, who could sustain the full force of who she actually was, without requiring her to perform a manageable version of it. She had not found that yet. She found it briefly, devastatingly, in a way that ended in wreckage in Michael Todd. Todd was a theatrical producer. He was brash, brilliant, physically commanding, and entirely unintimidated by Elizabeth Taylor's fame, which was, by the mid-1950s, the most significant female fame in the world. He pursued her with the specific confidence of a man who understood that the thing she had been performing her entire life was a role, and who was interested in the person underneath it. She married him in February 1957. She was 25. She described it later as the first time she had felt entirely seen. On the 22nd of March 1958, 13 months after the wedding, Michael Todd died when his private plane named the Liz crashed near Grants, New Mexico. He was 48 years old. Elizabeth Taylor was 26. She was home with a respiratory infection. She had been supposed to be on that plane. She was home because she was sick. She was 26 years old, and she had already survived a violent marriage, an insufficient one, and now the death of the man she had described as the first person who had ever fully seen her. She was 26 years old. And here is the detail that the world almost always skips in its rush to get to the Eddie Fisher scandal. In the weeks following Michael Todd's death, Elizabeth Taylor was in a grief so total that the people around her described genuine fear for her survival, not metaphorical fear. Clinical concern. She could not eat. She could not sleep. She could not be left alone. The person who sat with her was Debbie Reynolds. Debbie Reynolds, who was married to Eddie Fisher, who was Michael Todd's best friend, who was Elizabeth Taylor's close friend. Debbie Reynolds sat with her in the grief, brought her food, made sure she was not alone. And then, in the specific, desperate, grief-destroyed logic of a 26-year-old woman who had just lost the first person who had ever seen her clearly, Elizabeth Taylor fell in love with Debbie Reynolds' husband. I am going to tell you the full Eddie Fisher story in part 4. But I want you to hold this question because the answer changes everything. Was what happened with Eddie Fisher a betrayal? Or was it a woman in the most extreme grief of her life, reaching for the one person who had been physically closest to the man she had lost, and making a catastrophic decision that she would spend years being publicly punished for, while the man who made the same decision walked away with considerably less consequence? Hold that question, because the answer when it comes will make you look at Debbie Reynolds differently, and Eddie Fisher, and the entire machinery of public morality that decided, in 1958, that Elizabeth Taylor was the villain of a story in which she was, at minimum, equally a victim. Eddie Fisher left Debbie Reynolds for Elizabeth Taylor. The world never forgave Taylor. In part 4, I am going to show you what actually happened and ask you why the woman always became the story while the man became a footnote. Eddie Fisher left Debbie Reynolds. This is the fact that the narrative always inverts. Eddie Fisher, a grown man, a husband, a father, made a decision. He left his wife. He pursued Elizabeth Taylor. He initiated the relationship with the specific agency of an adult who understood what he was doing. The world blamed Elizabeth Taylor, not equally, not proportionally, not in the careful, even-handed way that moral judgment is supposed to work when two people make a decision together. The world blamed Elizabeth Taylor. Columnists called her a homewrecker. Fan mail turned to hate mail overnight. Theaters in America threatened to boycott her films. A woman who had been the most beloved actress in the world, whose face had sold more tickets than almost any other face in the history of American cinema became, within weeks of the Fisher story breaking publicly, one of the most hated women in America. Eddie Fisher received considerably less. He lost some fans. He faced some professional consequences. He was described as weak-willed, as a man who had been seduced by an irresistible force. The language of his coverage was the language of a man who had been acted upon, rather than a man who had acted. Elizabeth Taylor had acted. Elizabeth Taylor had wanted. Elizabeth Taylor had taken. This was the framing. And it tells you something specific and important about 1958 and about every year since, which is that when a powerful woman wants something and pursues it and obtains it, the story that gets written is always about her transgression rather than about her desire. She was 26 years old. She was in grief. She made a catastrophic decision that hurt Debbie Reynolds, who was genuinely hurt, who was a genuine friend, whose pain was real and documented and deserved acknowledgement. And she was punished for it in a way that Eddie Fisher never was, because Eddie Fisher was a man, and men's desire was understandable, and women's desire was transgression. They married in 1959. The marriage lasted 5 years. It produced no children. It was, by the accounts of people who were close to both of them, a marriage built on grief and proximity, rather than the specific kind of match that Elizabeth Taylor actually needed. She had reached for Eddie Fisher in the wreckage of Michael Todd's death. She had confused proximity to grief with connection. And then, on the set of Cleopatra in Rome, in 1962, she met Richard Burton. Richard Burton, the most significant relationship of her life, the most consuming, the most destructive, the most alive. Burton was a Welsh actor of extraordinary talent, one of the finest stage actors of his generation, a man whose voice alone was described by colleagues as a physical force. He was also married. He was also, by his own later admission, a functioning alcoholic whose relationship with drink was inseparable from his relationship with everything else he did. He met Elizabeth Taylor on the set of Cleopatra. He was 36. She was 29. And what happened between them, the specific, documented, witnessed chemistry of two people who had both spent their lives performing for audiences and had never found someone who could see past. The performance was immediate and total and entirely mutual. They began an affair on set. The world found out. The Vatican, the actual Vatican, issued a formal statement condemning Elizabeth Taylor's behavior. She received death threats. She was described in congressional hearings as an example of moral degeneracy in Hollywood. The United States government, the actual government, discussed whether her visa should be revoked. She was 30 years old. And here is the specific detail that none of the coverage of the Cleopatra affair fully addressed. Richard Burton was also having an affair. He was also married. He was also making the same decision that Elizabeth Taylor was making with the same agency, in the same hotel, on the same film set. And Richard Burton received a fraction of the moral condemnation that Elizabeth Taylor received. Because he was Richard Burton, a man, a genius, a force of nature whose desire was understood as the inevitable product of his extraordinary nature. She divorced Eddie Fisher. She married Richard Burton in 1964. And what followed in the decade of their marriage and their divorce and their remarriage and their second divorce was the most publicly consumed love story of the 20th century. The diamonds, the yachts, the hotels, the arguments that staff heard through walls, the reconciliations that photographers captured on beaches, the drinking that both of them maintained with the specific determination of people who had found in alcohol a way to sustain an emotional pitch that would otherwise have been unsustainable. They brought out the best in each other professionally. They brought out the worst in each other personally. They were, and this is not romantic mythology, this is the considered assessment of people who knew them both genuinely, completely, catastrophically in love. In love in the way that is not good for either person. In love in the way that consumes rather than sustains. They divorced in 1974. They remarried in 1975. They divorced again in 1976. And Richard Burton, who had matched her, who had seen her, who had been the most consuming presence of her life, died in 1984, 8 years after their final divorce. He was 58 years old. She was 52 when he died. And here is what she said about Richard Burton in the years after his death in interviews, in private conversations that people who were present later documented. She said that he was the love of her life, that she had never stopped loving him, that the 2 divorces had been necessary for survival and had not changed anything fundamental about what she felt. She was 52 years old, and she had already outlived 2 of the men she had loved most. The marriages that came after Burton John Warner, the Virginia senator, in 1976, Larry Fortensky, the construction worker she met in rehab, in 1991, these are the marriages that the world found most inexplicable, most evidence of recklessness, most proof of the narrative that had been building since Conrad Hilton Jr., that Elizabeth Taylor was a woman who could not stop. But here is what I want you to understand about John Warner and Larry Fortensky, about the 2 marriages that followed the second Richard Burton divorce. She was 52 years old when she married Larry Fortensky. She had outlived 1 husband. She had survived 7 marriages. She had been a child star, a studio product, a Vatican scandal, a congressional hearing subject, a grief-destroyed young widow, and the most publicly consumed romantic figure of her generation. She had spent 40 years being required to perform on screen, in marriages, in the specific theatre of public life that celebrity had made unavoidable. And she still believed, at 52, that the thing she was looking for, the specific safety and recognition and completeness that she had been reaching for since she was 9 years old, on an MGM set was possible, was findable, was worth trying for one more time. That is not recklessness. That is the most human thing about her. And it is the thing that the counting of marriages, the seven, always the 7, was specifically designed to obscure. In part 5, I am going to tell you about 1985, about the HIV/AIDS crisis, about what Elizabeth Taylor did when Hollywood turned its back on dying men and what it cost her to do it. Because this is the part of her story that her 7 marriages have almost completely buried. In 1985, while she was between her 6th and 7th marriages, while the world was still counting and judging and producing think pieces about what her personal life revealed about her character, Elizabeth Taylor did something that changed American public health history. She founded AMFAR, the American Foundation for AIDS Research. This requires context. In 1985, the context matters enormously. AIDS was not the manageable chronic condition it has become in the decades since. In 1985, AIDS was a death sentence. It was poorly understood, actively feared, and this is the detail that determines everything about what Elizabeth Taylor did, it was associated in the public mind almost exclusively with gay men. With a population that Ronald Reagan's administration had decided was not worth the political cost of acknowledging. Reagan did not say the word AIDS publicly until 1987. By then, 20,000 Americans had died. In 1985, when saying the word AIDS in a public speech was still a political calculation that most powerful people in America declined to make, Elizabeth Taylor stood up at a fundraiser and said it, clearly, repeatedly, without the careful hedging of someone managing a public image. She said it because her friend Rock Hudson was dying of it, because she had watched him deteriorate, and she had held his hand, and she had understood, with the specific clarity of someone who had spent her entire life being consumed by an image, that the image of AIDS was killing people just as surely as the virus was. She raised money. She used her name, the name that MGM had built and that 7 marriages had made infamous, and she put it on letters and at fundraising dinners and in congressional testimony. She sat beside men who were dying in hospital beds, and she held their hands. When the photographers who had spent 30 years documenting her private life turned up outside AIDS wards, expecting her to maintain the careful distance that most celebrities maintained, she did not maintain it. She touched people. In 1985, when touching was still feared. When the science was still unclear enough that fear was not entirely irrational. She touched people because she understood in a way that most of her contemporaries were not willing to demonstrate publicly that the specific cruelty of dying without human contact was a cruelty she was not going to participate in by omission. Hollywood turned on her. Not completely, not universally, but the specific, documented cooling of her professional relationships in the mid-1980s, the way certain doors closed, certain invitations stopped arriving, certain collaborators became unavailable. This is documented by people who were present in that industry during that period. AIDS activism was not safe in 1985. It was not a cause that studios and producers and networks were eager to associate their assets with. And Elizabeth Taylor, who was no longer a studio asset in the contractual sense, but who still depended on the industry's goodwill for her continued relevance, chose the cause anyway. She raised over $270 million for HIV/AIDS research over the course of her lifetime. She is credited by the scientists and researchers and public health officials who worked in this field with having materially affected the trajectory of American AIDS research funding at a moment when material effect was possible and government was deliberately absent. $270 million. Raised by a woman the world was still primarily discussing in terms of how many times she had been married. And here is the question I want you to sit with, because it connects to everything I have told you about MGM and Conrad Hilton and Richard Burton and the 7 marriages and the specific, institutional, lifelong project of reducing Elizabeth Taylor to a number. If Elizabeth Taylor had been a man, if the same career, the same marriages, the same activism had been performed by a male actor of equivalent fame, would the number of marriages have been the story? Or would the $270 million have been the story? You already know the answer. In part 6, I am going to tell you what Elizabeth Taylor said in the last years of her life about the marriages, not the mythology, her actual words. And I am going to tell you about the one relationship she had that the world almost never discusses because it does not fit the narrative of a woman who could not stop falling recklessly in love. In the last decade of her life, in the years between her final divorce from Larry Fortensky in 1996 and her death in 2011, Elizabeth Taylor did not marry again. She was 64 years old when her seventh marriage ended. She had heart problems. She had survived multiple near-death experiences, a bout of pneumonia in 1990 that her doctors described as genuinely life-threatening, a brain tumor removed in 1997, hip replacements, back surgeries, the accumulated physical consequences of a life lived at a pitch that her body had been sustaining for 7 decades. She did not marry again. And what she said in interviews in this final period, in the specific, unguarded way of someone who has decided that performance is no longer worth the energy it costs about the marriages, about what she had been looking for, about what she had found. And what she had not found is the most honest accounting of her own life that she ever gave. She said that she had never been good at being alone. She said it simply, without apology, without the performance of regret that the world had always wanted from her, the public acknowledgement that she had been reckless, that she had been wrong, that the 7 was a number she was ashamed of. She did not give them that. She said she had never been good at being alone because she had never been alone. From the age of 9, from the moment MGM put her on a set and surrounded her with adults who required things from her, she had never had the experience of existing without an audience, without someone who needed her to be something specific, without the performance. And the marriages, the 7, always the 7, had been, in some fundamental way, the only form of genuine privacy available to her, the only space where the audience was, theoretically, reduced to 1, where the performance was, theoretically, suspended, where Elizabeth Taylor, the person rather than the product, was, theoretically, allowed to exist. That she kept choosing men who could not sustain that space, who brought their own requirements, their own audiences, their own performances, is not evidence of recklessness. It is evidence of someone who was looking for something specific in the only place the world had left her to look. Now, Michael Jackson. The friendship between Elizabeth Taylor and Michael Jackson is the relationship from her final decades that the world finds most inexplicable and discusses least seriously. They met in the mid-1980s. They became, by the accounts of both of them, in multiple interviews and statements, genuinely close friends. He called her his closest confidant. She called him the most misunderstood person she had ever known. Think about what that means. Elizabeth Taylor, the woman the world had reduced to a number for 50 years, calling Michael Jackson the most misunderstood person she had ever known. 2 people who had been child performers, who had been owned by institutions before they were old enough to understand ownership, who had been built into products, and then blamed for the psychological consequences of that building finding in each other. Finally, someone who did not require explanation. She defended him publicly when no one else would. She stood beside him when standing beside him was professionally costly. She did not perform the careful distancing that most of his former associates managed when the accusations came. She said clearly, on the record, that she knew him and she believed in him, and she was not going to pretend otherwise because it was inconvenient. This is the woman the world reduced to a number. Now her children. The comments on a competitor video about Elizabeth Taylor, a video that received nearly 600,000 views, were overwhelmingly about one thing. Not the marriages, not the diamonds, the motherhood. Comment after comment from people who had expected, given the mythology of 7 marriages and studio scandal and decades of tabloid coverage, to find evidence of neglect or damage or the specific harm that famous mothers are always assumed to have visited on their children. What they found instead was this. Elizabeth Taylor's 4 children, Michael, Christopher, Liza, and Maria, are, by every available account, functioning, grounded, productive human beings who speak of their mother with warmth and without the specific, careful distance of adult children managing complicated legacies. She showed up. That is what they say. In every version, in every interview, she showed up. For a woman who had spent her entire professional life showing up for other people's stories, for MGM's product, for the studio's requirements, for the world's consumption of her private life. She reserved something genuine for the people who needed her most to be real. She showed up. And here is what that means in the specific context of everything I have told you about 9 years old on an MGM set and Conrad Hilton Jr. and Michael Todd's plane and Richard Burton's voice and the Vatican statement and the congressional hearing and the $270 million and the AIDS wards and the seven, always the seven. It means that the thing MGM could not own, the thing that 7 marriages and 50 years of public consumption had not been able to reduce to a product, was the thing she gave to her children. The real thing, the unperformed thing, herself. In part 7, I am going to ask you the one question about Elizabeth Taylor that nobody asked while she was alive. The question that her 7 marriages were always being used to avoid. And I'm going to tell you what I think the real answer is. Here is the question nobody asked. What would Elizabeth Taylor have been? What would she have become? What would she have built? What would she have found if MGM had not signed her at 9 years old? If she had been allowed to grow up? To develop, privately, the extraordinary intelligence and emotional capacity that everyone who knew her acknowledged as the most significant things about her. To reach adulthood with some foundational experience of existing as a person rather than a product. To enter her first relationship, her first marriage, with some understanding, built through ordinary experience of what she needed and what she was capable of sustaining. We cannot know. The question has no answer. What happened, happened. The contract was signed, the set was lit, the product was built, and Elizabeth Taylor spent the next 70 years being simultaneously celebrated and consumed by a world that had decided, before she was old enough to object, what she was for. But here is what the question tells us. Every marriage, the seven, always the seven, was, in some specific and documentable way, a search for the thing that MGM took. The specific, private, unperformed experience of being known, not famous, not desired, not consumed. Known. Conrad Hilton Jr. could not give her that he was violent and she was 18, and neither of them had the tools for it. Michael Wilding could not give her that he was kind, and she was 20, and what she needed was beyond what kindness could reach. Michael Todd could give her something close to it, could give her the specific feeling of being seen, and then he died in a plane with her name on it. Eddie Fisher was grief and proximity, and a catastrophic decision that she was punished for more than he was. Richard Burton could match her, could sustain the full force of who she actually was, but matching is not the same as knowing, and the consuming nature of their love destroyed as much as it created. John Warner needed a senator's wife rather than a person. Larry Fortensky needed, and this is the most human version of the story, someone who would simply love him without the performance. And she tried. With each one she tried. Not recklessly, not carelessly. With the specific, enormous, entirely unmanufactured capacity to feel things that had survived MGM and Conrad Hilton and Michael Todd's death and the Vatican's condemnation and 7 marriages and a congressional hearing and $270 million raised while Hollywood quietly closed its doors. She tried 7 times, and the world counted and called it recklessness, and never once asked the question that the counting was designed to prevent. Why? Now you know why. Elizabeth Taylor died on the 23rd of March 2011. She was 79 years old, congestive heart failure. She died in the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, in the city that had taken her at 9 years old and built something extraordinary and consuming from the raw material of a child who had violet eyes and a mother who understood that beauty was currency. Her son Christopher was with her. She is buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. Her grave is simple. Her name, her dates, nothing about the marriages, nothing about the diamonds, nothing about the Vatican, or the congressional hearing, or the 7, just her name. Elizabeth Rosamond Taylor. She was born in London in 1932, and she died in Los Angeles in 2011. And in between, she was in no particular order: a child star, a studio product, a wife 7 times, a mother 4 times, a grandmother 10 times, a great-grandmother 4 times, an AIDS activist who raised $270 million, a friend to Michael Jackson when friendship was costly, a woman who showed up for her children in the specific, unperformed way that the most important kind of showing up requires. And she was, beneath all of it, beneath the performance and the product and the mythology and the 7. Always the 7. A person who had been handed to an institution at 9 years old and had spent the rest of her life trying to recover something that the institution had not known it was taking. The right to be unknown, the right to be ordinary, the right to be in a room with someone who needed nothing from her except her presence. She found it, in the end. Not in the marriages, not fully, not sustainably, not in the specific way she had been reaching for since Conrad Hilton and the honeymoon that broke something in her that took decades to name. She found it in her children, in Christopher, who was with her when she died, in the grandchildren who have her eyes. She found it in the AIDS wards in 1,985 inches, the specific, unwitnessed moments of holding a dying man's hand in a room where her fame meant nothing and her marriages meant nothing, and the only thing that existed was the human fact of one person being present for another. She found it in Michael Jackson, who understood without explanation what it meant to have been a product before you were a person. She found it imperfectly and incompletely, and with the specific, stubborn refusal to give up that had been the most consistent thing about her. From 9 years old to 79, she found it. Here is what I take from the life of Elizabeth Taylor. The world counted her marriages because counting was easier than asking. Counting produced a number and a conclusion and a narrative that fit the specific requirements of a culture that needed women's desire to be transgression, and women's choices to be cautionary tales, and women's lives to be legible in the simple terms of success or failure. 7. Failure. Move on. What the number obscured was a human being of extraordinary complexity who had been placed in an extraordinary situation before she was old enough to choose it, and who navigated that situation with more grace and more generosity and more genuine love than the situation had any right to expect. From her, she was not reckless. She was a child who grew up on a set, surrounded by adults who needed things from her face, who spent 70 years looking for one person, just one, who needed nothing from her face at all. And she raised 4 children who call her, consistently and without performing it, the most loving and present parent they could have asked for. The world counted 7 marriages. Her children counted 1 mother. I think they were counting the right thing. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Elizabeth Taylor married 7 times. The world counted. Nobody asked why. Now you know why. Does knowing why change how you count? Leave your answer below. I read every single comment. If this moved you, please share it. Because Elizabeth Taylor raised $270 million for HIV/AIDS research while Hollywood turned its back. She held dying men's hands in 1985 when touching them was still feared. She showed up for her children in the way that mattered most. And the world spent 50 years counting her marriages. She deserved better than the number. Next week, we go deeper into the world of women who were owned before they understood what ownership meant. A woman whose story connects directly to everything you have heard today. A woman whose name you know, whose real story has been buried beneath a mythology so complete that almost nobody has questioned it. Subscribe so you do not miss it. This is Mary of Shadows. Thank you for being here.